That's the ambition penalty, right? Either they're going to keep going and sort of hard charging and they burn out or take a hit for it, or they'll end up leaving the workforce.
There's a line in your book, "The world benefits when women burn out." Can you unpack this for us? Welcome to Everyone's Talking Money, where we get brutally honest about money, mindset, and making life richer. Amina, your book, The Ambition Trap, hits at something so many women feel but rarely name: this exhausting loop of too much and not enough. So, where does that internal tug of war really begin, and how do we break it?
Yes. In the ambition trap, what I wanted to talk about was not just the mindsets that we all have, but also the system that we operate in that reinforces a lot of these ideas. And so, first and foremost, I thought it was really important that we redefine ambition because I actually don't think we have a great working definition for it. I think a lot of what we've culturally come to understand ambition as is sort of more for more sake all the time, but it leaves us depleted and it reinforces a lot of these toxic systems. And so I actually think ambition is neutral and natural, and it's for everybody. And it's simply a desire for growth, a desire for more life. And actually, ambition is much more like a perennial flower versus that more growth all the time. So it's like we have this seedling of desire that we want to grow and we drop it into the ground and we nurture that inner and outer environment. And therefore, we kind of rise and we have this momentary beautiful peak in the sun. And then the seasons change and the petals fall off and we wind back down and go underground where we rest until we're ready to take aim again. And I felt like it was so important to redefine it and talk about it in these waves and these cycles because that more for more sake all the time causes us to try to outwork a system that wasn't necessarily designed for us to thrive in, particularly for women, for people of color, for other historically excluded people. We're often told to be and not to be at the very same time.
Yeah, it is hard because women always dance this fine line of too much, not enough. You're assertive. If you're too assertive, you're the B word. If you're too strong, you're intimidating. There's it's always a fine line. There's a dance to it that we have to do. Why is that? And is some of that self-imposed?
Yes. So some of it are mindsets that we've adopted, right? Of like, I can't take up too much space. If I take up too much space, I'm going to cause harm. So in the book, I'm very careful to kind of separate out these two tracks. If there's always stuff that we need to look at on our side of the street where we're telling ourselves stories about what we can and can't achieve. And then also we're operating in a system that may reinforce that. So when I looked at the data, what I saw was men and women enter the workforce with the same levels of ambition. Men are rewarded for their ambition. For women, it's seen as a detractor, right? So then we kind of tamp ours down a little bit. Ambitious women that negotiate their salaries are seen as difficult and hard to work with. And women of color are actually the most ambitious cohort in the workplace, and they experience the most resistance, the most microaggressions, the most headwinds. And so we're seeing these really ambitious people not having a place to put their ambition, and that causes all sorts of friction for us.
And what is some of that friction that we experience?
Yeah. So this idea of being told to be and not to be at the very same time, right? Then sometimes we can decide and take it upon ourselves of, well, then I'm going to outwork the system, right? I'm going to be the first one in, the last one out. I'm going to try to get things perfect. And I think so much of that is what's led us to burnout, right? Depending on what studies you read, 70 or 80% of us are experiencing burnout right now. And I think especially for women and other historically excluded people, right? We're like, we've got all of this amazing things inside of ourselves, these things that we want to contribute, but we're kind of taking a hit for it, right? Ambitious women are told to kind of speak up and throw their hat in the ring. And then when we speak truth to power, we're told our stories aren't real. Or people with disabilities inside of organizations may throw their hat in the ring, but then they don't get those basic accommodations. And then they try to either outwork, which will exacerbate illness, injury, and disability, or they'll underperform, right? So it's kind of this catch 22, this false binary. And I think it's making a lot of us sick. And I think that's a big reason that so many of us are experiencing burnout right now, along with some other factors too. But I think it's a big piece.
And I think that it's just the way society is, we're rewarded almost, or it's encouraged to do so much. Like
100%.
you taking a nap. Like, I feel guilty sometimes if I have to go rest my eyes for 30 minutes. Like, I feel bad for that if I have to do that in the middle of the day, when studies have shown that's actually super healthy for you. And then you wake up and you're more productive as a result of it. But no, you feel guilty for it and you're told to go, go, go. Or, you're superwoman. You can handle everything. You can do everything. And then you're kind of rewarded or praised for that. And it's like, I'm killing myself over here. I'm dying. Like, this is hard.
Yes.
But I think that we feel obligated to keep up with this, working hard to be like, well, someone thinks I'm superwoman. I need to keep doing this. So how do we break that? And how do we recognize, though? Because I feel like we don't realize that we're at that cusp of burning out until we're close to being burnt.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're so right. We're rewarded for it, right? We're kind of seen as super women. It's seen as a superpower. There's that old adage that it's if you want something done, ask a busy woman, right? And, I was looking at the data on this too, and it's even people that are higher up on the economic ladder feel so much financial precarity right now that even they are overworking. So many of us are overworking because we're rewarded for it. There's the financial reward, or we're worried about the fallout if we don't overwork, right? So there's all these reasons that's leading us to do it. And I think that awareness is honestly 80% of it. And, when I'm working with my clients, one of the things I'll have them look at is how much visible labor are you doing? So that's the work that we do that's seen and paid for. And then how much invisible labor are you doing? That's the work that we do that is unseen and unpaid for. And we do it at both work and at home. And so just starting to notice how much you're overgiving, how much you're overworking, and are there places that we could kind of pull that back, especially around the invisible labor piece, because we're not being paid for it, right? And it's taking a toll on all of us. And so I think it's really important that we start to look at those different areas. And unfortunately, like you said, it's like a lot of us don't know that we're burnt out, or we don't pause until we've taken a really big hit. And this is something, I've been an executive coach for the last 10 years, and I've had a front row seat to all of these high achievers. And I noticed the same pattern. It's right. We get our lesson when we get our lesson and not a moment before. And some of us do need to take a big hit for it because we're not listening to the whispers, right? We're not listening to those, little messages from our bodies that are saying, slow down. We wait for that big full stop moment, which was my story too. And so if we can kind of tune in to those quieter voices and hopefully get the lesson before something dramatic happens, right? Like a health crisis, which was my case, hopefully we can choose another way. But what's really interesting? I'm seeing a lot of Gen Z choose a different way. I think they're seeing Gen Xers and millennials be really burnt out, not have too much to show for it. And they're deciding, I want a little bit more work-life balance. And no generation is a monolith, but I do think that they've gotten the benefit of having to learn from us.
I feel like Gen Z in general is learning a lot from the millennials, and they're going in the opposite direction. As a millennial, I get some of it why, but why is that, and what lessons are they learning from us? And they're like, nope, I'm not touching that. No way.
Yeah. Well, I think so many of them are watching their millennial colleagues get burnt out, and they said, absolutely not. I did a training program at a Fortune 50 company, and it was for rising VPs. And all of them were wrestling with this question. They kept saying, I don't know if I want to go to the next level. I'm watching the person that's above me, and they have no work-life balance. A lot of them have been sick. And that just doesn't look exciting for me. That doesn't look like where I want to spend time. It doesn't look like it's going to grow me in the ways that I want to. And so I think that they're just watching these generations ahead of them, and they're deciding that they want a different life. And I also think that they're seeing, I'm elder millennial too. And just even the difference between like us and baby boomers, right? Baby boomers were able to work really hard. And I'm speaking generally now, right? Work really hard, and they could have houses, they could pay off their student loans, all the things that millennials and Gen Z can't do. And so I think they're like, what's the point of all this?
Yeah, but it's interesting too because millennials were painted as lazy, right? But now is it just because we've had enough time in the workforce, or that we're showing that no, we're actually not, again, generally speaking,
Yeah.
no, we're not that lazy. We're actually working ourselves to the bone, to the point of that it's hurting us health-wise and mentally.
Yeah.
How did that shift happen? And why are millennials functioning this way? Is it because we, went to college, we got the higher education, we feel like we need to use it now, or it was a waste? Is that part of the pressure?
That's a really interesting question. And, so much of the conversation, again, I'm elder millennial, right? So much of the conversation around millennials was around entitlement. And I think a lot of it was around setting boundaries that previous generations probably didn't have the ability to set in the workplace. And so, my story is that I overworked so hard that I burned out and developed 2 autoimmune diseases and was days away from organ failure. So my story was not a lazy one. And I doubt yours is too, right? So I think that, some people probably got it wrong. And I'm sure there are some millennials that just decide I don't want to work. And that's totally up to them. That's their prerogative, right? But Anne Helen Peterson wrote the book. The subtitle is How Millennials Became the Burnout Generation. I've forgotten the title. And essentially, what she talks about is a lot of millennials graduated around the time of the Great Recession, which meant they graduated and there were no jobs. And so a lot of them either went back to school or just really struggled to make ends meet. And so coming of age at this time and some other cultural factors too, they decided like, okay, financial precarity is such a big part of our reality. We're going to work so hard that we don't have to experience that ever again, right? There was just so much uncertainty at that time. So I think you do see a large swath of the millennial population overworking because they came of age in that really precarious moment.
It's funny, I was in the financial services industry when 2008 happened, and I think I was like month 3
Oh
on my job, and I'm just watching it all. It's all just happening, like it's just happening every day. It just felt like, okay, well, this is just how it is, right? Like people were freaking out, of course, but it was like, okay, well, this is just what I have in store for me for my life if I'm going to work in finance, and it just seemed normal, but it's like, okay, well, also, how do I protect myself from this from happening? Because I'm like, well, this is what's just going to happen.
right. Exactly.
There's a line in your book that stopped me when I was reading, and it was, the world benefits when women burn out. Can you unpack this for us?
Hmm. The world benefits from so much of women's labor, right? And so if we're telling ourselves a story that we can't rest, that we can't pause, that we can't take a beat, we're going to stay in that momentum. And I think the world absolutely benefits from us staying in that momentum. So it's what I was talking about before. We're doing so much both visible labor and invisible labor. And if we pause for a moment and say, I don't want to do that visible or invisible labor, there's going to be a big drop in terms of production, right? So I think the world really does benefit from us doing so much and carrying so much on our backs. And so I think that we really have to rewrite the conversation around women and money, around women and work, around women and ambition, which is what I was setting out to do with this book.
What's some of the invisible labor that we do that we don't even realize we might be doing, or that it's bogging us down?
Yes. In a work context, it could look like volunteering to be the office therapist. That was very much my role too. I was like, yes, I'm your manager and the door is open and let's talk about your divorce. Let's talk about what's happening at home. I've got time for you. And then guess what? I didn't get to do my own work until 6 p.m. And then I'm there till midnight because I spent all day being the office therapist. So that's one example. We see a lot of people volunteer to be the office secretary too, right? So I'll take notes and I'll make sure that we know everybody's birthdays and that we're organizing all of these events. Even things that are wonderful and really supportive to a work culture, like volunteering to be the head of an ERG, right? Which can be really helpful to have these employee resource groups. But that's additional work that you're doing that isn't paid for. And when we do too much of that, we can tip into burnout. At home, it looks like, organizing the child care, knowing everything about the doctors, connecting with the teachers, doing the back to school nights, the parents' evenings, elder care, right? All the things that we do that is unseen and unpaid for, that is such an emotional burden and mental burden to be carrying around all the time.
We're recording this in the beginning of June, and we just went through a period of time called Maycember. And it is the craziest time of year because school is ending. There's performances and recitals and presents and more presents and cards and there's so many things. It feels just like the holiday season, but without cookies and all of that fun stuff.
Yeah.
And every May, and every December, I say the same things. Like, I need someone to just follow me around and help me with all of this stuff.
Yes.
And then come June or January, I no longer need that. But that just shows all the extra stuff that you do, and you don't realize it till it's like all piled up on top of you.
Right. And like, do you get a break after that or do you have to keep going? Most parents have to keep going, right?
Keep going, right? Absolutely,
Exactly.
because now we're in summer camp season.
And the next thing and the next thing. And this is why we have so much burnout, right? Because like there are no places for you to pause. And, we don't have the same community that we used to have, right? And so a lot of community care could kind of step in and help us with that, right? Help with the childcare, maybe there's a meal train, all of those things. We don't have as much of that these days. And so the onus and the burden is on the individual, which is just too heavy.
So, in your coaching work, what limiting beliefs show up most often for women who quote unquote have it all on paper, but they still feel stuck, small, or unseen?
Yeah, I love this question so much. A lot of limiting beliefs about what's possible for us, right? A lot of the times they'll give it away to luck. I'll coach everybody from Fortune 100 leaders to VC backed founders to Olympians, and they have these amazing track records. And I'll reflect that back to them, and they're like, that was a fluke. That just happened by luck. And I don't love the L word because I see them working so hard. I heard somebody say once that the more we show up and show up well, we increase our surface area for luck. And I love that way of thinking about it, right? When you show up in excellence, you increase your surface area for luck. So is it really luck or are you magical and are you excellent and are you always dotting every I and crossing every T? So that part is always really interesting to me that, they're like, it was luck. And then the other piece is, they will so readily throw away their zone of genius. So each and every one of us has a zone of genius. And I talk about this in the book too, because when we build our careers around our zone of genius, it's a much more generative place to build from. And the impact that we can have is just even far more reaching. And when I'll sit with these amazing humans and we'll talk about their zone of genius and we'll come across something, they'll say inevitably, well, doesn't everybody have that gift? Can everybody do that thing? And it's like, no, that's really magical that you can do that. Not everybody is built that way. And so when I was researching for the book, I was like, why do so many women readily throw away their genius? Why are they so quick to say, I don't have any gifts? And I traced it all the way back to ancient Rome. And genius is almost always a hero and never a heroine. And there was a study that was done by the 92nd Street Y, and they found that even women, like something like 90% of women report genius as a male trait, not a female trait. And even girls as young as 6 think that genius is a male trait and not a female trait. So many of us are just ready to throw it away and discount it, but each and every one of us has a zone of genius and something to contribute.
So when you're sitting down and you're saying to someone like, no, that's amazing and that is your zone of genius. Well, no, no, no. How can you make sure that they actually believe it? Because it could be like, yeah, okay, thank you, and you move on. But what needs to be said or what hit them over the head to make sure that they really understand it and actually do believe that?
Yeah. And that's a process, right? Because what you're saying is like, how do we feel embodied around it so that we know it in every cell of our body versus just knowing it intellectually in our heads? And I think that takes time. But an exercise that I'll do with clients is I'll be like, okay, jot down 3 to 5 stories over the last year where something went really well, where you knocked something out of the park. Now tell me about what your zone of genius contributed to that. And then they'll start to see, okay, actually, when I show up in this thing, magic does happen. And then we'll kind of scenario plan. We'll say, well, if you didn't contribute that zone of genius, how might that have situation have played out? And they can start to see their contribution in it. But it is really hard. And then when you start to see those patterns, then I'll ask them to look forward, right? So we've seen it in the past. Now I want you to notice moment to moment when you're contributing that thing so you can start to see it in real life and kind of attune your nervous system to it so it feels like, yeah, that's amazing and I'm allowed to have it. And it really does shift things.
So, as you mentioned before, you worked with top executives at Google, Deloitte, and I imagine even they struggle with these issues, right? With the
Especially.
ambition.
Especially.
Especially, yeah. So they struggle with the ambition penalty or the exhausting loop of too much and not enough. But what have you noticed that high achieving women consistently get wrong about ambition?
Hmm. Yeah. I think a lot of the times what I'm noticing with high achieving women and their ambition is they think it has to be that like hard charging way and that it has to be that more for more sake all the time that we were talking about at the top of the conversation. So just to kind of, I alluded to this before, but to share a little bit more, in my late 20s, I worked in marketing and brand management. And I was working so hard. I was the first one in, the last one out, the 70, 80-hour weeks, putting everybody ahead of myself. And this is a story that, so many people have the same one. And then I burned out and I developed 2 autoimmune diseases and, went to a bunch of different doctors. And then I got a call one Friday where my doctor said, if you don't go to the hospital now, instead of going to work, you'll be days away from multiple organ failure. And so I had been working so hard. I'd gotten so sick. I had but two choices: to keep going the way that I was going or to exit the planet.
I'm assuming you went to the hospital that Friday to when your doctor called you,
Well,
right?
it's honestly kind of wild, and I think this tells you a lot about my mindset. Is I went to work, and then after working the day, I was like, "Oh, maybe I," it took a minute for it to kind of land in my body that something was really wrong, and then at the end of the day is when I went.
Were you still checking emails in the hospital bed?
It's a great question. I don't remember that part. All I remember is that, like, I did not get my butt to the hospital until the end of the day, and, like, when people hear that, they're like, "Wow, you must have been in quite a state," right? Yeah, kind of shocking. I mean, I'm sure on some level I was checking my emails while I was there. I don't think I even really believed the diagnosis until a little while after.
And was there a change immediately after, or did it take time to accept, "Oh, this is really what I was doing to myself, and this is why"?
I think it's a both and. There were things that I put in place immediately, and then there were things that really took a lot of time. Like, to this day, it takes something out of me to assert a really firm boundary, right? Because I'm like, I just want everyone to be happy and to get what they need. And so, recovering codependent over here. So there's things that kind of, shifted quite quickly and things that really took time. But at the time, after I came home from the hospital, I was talking to my roommate at the time, and she was like, "Oh, one of my friends just did this life coaching program." And I just knew that was the thing I needed to do. So I went to life coaching, and they taught me all about boundaries, and they taught me all about the areas in my life where I was making myself a victim and not serving myself. And it was so helpful to see. And so after that weekend, I really did change a lot of things. And it actually set me on the course of becoming a coach, where I could teach others so that they wouldn't have to have the rock bottom that I had. And so, yeah, some things have really taken time and some things were quite quick.
I really feel like there is a correlation between the people pleasing or the codependency and ambition, right? And it doesn't have to be ambition with your job. It's whatever you want to overdo. So it's like just the overdoing.
I see this pattern over and over again with my clients. They think that ambition has to be this painful thing where we just wring the productivity out of our bodies, which led me to create this framework on ambition that's in the book. So, in the book, I talk about there's two types of ambition. There's painful ambition that's driven by a core wound, which was my story and a lot of my clients. And then there's purposeful ambition that comes from a place of truth, a place of wholeness. So, in the painful ambition, which is kind of the dominant paradigm, our desire for growth and achievement is coming from a core wound. So, there's 5 core wounds, and they are rejection, abandonment, humiliation, betrayal, and injustice. And each and every one of us has one, two, three, or all 5 of those core wounds. It's just a very human rite of passage. You can have the best parents on the planet and you'll still have a core wound. You could get them on the playground or vicariously. We just have them. And then as a result of the wound, we wear a corresponding mask. So, for example, if we have a rejection wound, the mask we wear is avoidance. We'll avoid throwing our hat in the ring for the thing because we don't want to be rejected. Or if we have a betrayal wound, the mask we wear is control. If we're worried that people aren't going to show up in the way that we want to, we'll just control everything to make sure that we get the outcome that we want. But you can imagine if our ambition is coming from that place, it's going to be really wobbly. So for a lot of the hard charging, high achieving people that I work with, initially it is coming from that wounded place. And that was my story too.
We have similar conversations about money, whether your issues with money, how you feel about it, it all comes from usually when you were younger and, this hole you're trying to fill.
Yeah.
So do you think ambition and money go hand in hand? Do you feel like many of these people that you work with, they're also trying to make money to fill these wounds? Or is it just ambition for ambition's sake?
I think it's a both and. And a lot of the times, the wounds around ambition match the wounds around money, right? So we just talked about the rejection wound. And with the rejection wound, we wear the avoidance mask. And so I'll notice that those people are also, they're avoidant around their money. They're avoidant around putting themselves out there for the promotion or for the raise because they're worried about the rejection. And so there's almost a direct correlation with our money as well. And yeah, and then we're trying to use anything outside of ourselves to fill ourselves up, right? The title bump, the pay increase, the award, so that we feel whole and worthy versus doing the work on the inside.
So conversely, let's talk about the ambition penalty.
Mhm.
So what happens when women get exactly what they worked for, but instead of celebration, they're met with resistance, judgment, and distance?
Yeah, I mean, that's the ambition penalty, right? It's like we're told to be ambitious. And then when we are, we're said, like, hey, that's not polite. We don't like the way that looks on you and your identity. And let's give you some demerits for it, right? And so then a lot of people have a reconciliatory moment. Either they're going to keep going and sort of hard charging and they're going to make a place for themselves and maybe, they burn out or take a hit for it, or they'll end up leaving the workforce. At the beginning of the pandemic, we saw women and women of color leaving the workforce in droves because they weren't supported and their ambitions weren't supported. And so then they turn to entrepreneurship because they have a bit more agency there. And so I think sometimes when there's no space for our ambition, either like that internal fire burns us out because there's no place to put it, or we'll redirect it somewhere else. And I think that can be really healthy, right? Because our work doesn't have to be our be all end all, even though we spend so much time there. So, where can we use our ambition in other places in our lives? I've had so many conversations with women that say, well, I'm ambitious about motherhood, or I'm ambitious about my art practice, or I'm ambitious about rest. And I'm like, cool, great. If your workplace doesn't celebrate your ambitions in these ways, let's try to redirect that to other places so you have a place for them to flow.
So, financial independence doesn't always equal emotional freedom. So,
Mm,
how do we reconcile our bank account success when our inner voice says this is still not enough?
yeah. Yeah. If the numbers are showing us that it's enough and we've run the equation and we're like, okay, like I can actually happily retire. I've got my 25 times my annual earnings. I'm good here, right? But inside, we still feel like, no, it's not enough. And I'm still coming from that place of scarcity. There's a story there. There's a wound there. There's even potentially trauma there, right? So we have to look for it. Because if we don't do the work on the inside, we are always going to seek things outside of ourselves to try to fill that hole. So the core wounds work is a really great place to start. What are some of those earliest stories that you've experienced around money? I have a lot of clients that experience a lot of financial trauma, whether they grew up in poverty or housing insecurity. And so they're like, I will work so hard so that I never have to experience that ever again. Or, maybe their parents had a lot of money, then they lost that money and they're kind of always waiting for the other shoe to drop. So we have to do the work on those original stories, those original wounds. Otherwise, we'll be in that perpetual cycle. It'll never leave us and nothing will ever be enough.
And is it just because we want to please everyone in every aspect of our lives? What, where's that come? What is that?
I actually have a whole section in the book about codependency. And, it's so funny because so many people don't connect with that phrase because, the working definition that we had of it was from Melody Beattie back in the 80s and it had a lot to do with addiction. But there's a beautiful new book by Terry Cole called Too Much. It just came out at the end of 2024 and it's about high functioning codependency. And it's much more what we're talking about here. The over giving, let me do the last thing, let you stay at my house, let me take care of you, let me make the meals, let me, kind of what we are culturally told to do and how many of us live into it. And so I think a lot of us are really afraid of the fallout if we don't do that thing, right? We're told to be good girls, to be hard workers, to take care of everybody. And if we're not that, are we going to get kicked out of the family system? Are we going to have to fend for ourselves, right? Humans, we're pack animals. And we're so worried to be on our own and to be ousted from the system that we'll often live into these roles to stay there, even if they're really dysfunctional for us. I know I have.
Yeah. Are they not going to be our friend anymore if we don't say yes to this event, or if I don't show up to everything? Is that going to be it for me? And it also is like and I don't know if insecurity is the best word, but it's like not feeling secure in whatever situation you're in, so you have to overdo it to overcompensate, to justify why you belong there, or why they should be your friend, or why you are the great employee, or whatever it is.
Yeah. And it's so interesting that you say this because so many of these high achieving people that I work with are so afraid of their growth and they're so afraid of their authenticity because they are worried that if they go to the next level and if they are more of themselves, people won't come with them and they'll be all alone up there. And sometimes that happens, right? Sometimes people fall away, but it is nothing compared to the people that you gain.
Do you see any correlation with super ambitious women and relationships, friendships, romantic relationships? Is there a correlation or anything that your research showed you?
So actually a lot of those core wounds that we experience in painful ambition, they will show up in our relationships, right? So speaking from experience, I'm a recovering avoidant, right? So I had that rejection wound. I also have the betrayal wound. So control are those things that show up in my relationships. And they would be mirrored back to me so much. I have one really close friendship, and we talked about this at my book launch, but I'm avoidant and she has the abandonment wound. So she's dependent, right? So in a relationship, what that looks like is the classic anxious and avoidant dynamic. And so those same wounds that are showing up with our ambition are going to show up in our relationships too. And we just want to be compassionate with ourselves because most of us have.
Everyone has something,
Yes.
right? I mean, at the end of the day, everyone has something.
Exactly.
No one is like totally, on the straight and narrow, I guess, as far as the way they feel about things or the way they function. So you kind of have to really look at what is your thing and be aware of it. And I think awareness is the biggest,
I
is
agree
to
with
be
you.
aware of it and then know the steps and then put those guardrails on to go, all right, you're starting to veer a little bit off into the, you're overdoing the people pleasing and all of that. And you're, and just having that awareness. But I feel like maybe that's really not something that was taught to us.
Course, of course. So, yeah, like you said, I think awareness is 80% of it. And then thinking about the context that kind of bring those things out of us, right? Like I notice that the betrayal wounds comes up and the control sneaks in when I'm moving really fast and I don't feel like I have the right support in place. Then I'm going to kind of go to that place. And so, okay, I noticed that I put myself in that position again where I didn't call in the right support. So now my control mask is coming up. What do I need to do to shift that out of the way? Who do I need to call for help? And so just thinking about our patterns, the context, and then the actions that we'll take moment to moment to help us choose something different.
If a listener's feeling emotionally burnout, professionally successful, but personally depleted, what's one question she can ask herself today to start coming home to her real ambition?
I love that question. I mean, obviously the workaround's core wounds, but I think one of the simplest questions that we can ask ourselves is like, what am I tolerating in my life that I need not be tolerating? What's the thing that I really need to raise the standard on today that will radically change my experience, right? So maybe we're tolerating being underpaid. Maybe we're tolerating overworking because we don't have the right support. What are the things that you're tolerating that you need to raise the standard on?